Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution and how it impacted society and the arts. And we've got a lot of different sources for this one. A Yale lecture transcript, some videos on art history and globalization, and even a piece on the value of arts and humanities. So our mission for this deep dive, I guess you could say, is to try to connect those dots and see how all of these different things relate to one another.
It's going to be a fascinating journey, I think, because it really challenges a lot of our assumptions about this period.
Yeah, when you think about the Industrial Revolution, I think most people think about giant factories and machines, right?
Right.
But the first source we're looking at, this Yale lecture, is pointing out that actually it wasn't just giant factories and machines. It was really like an intensification of things that were already happening, craft work, domestic industries. They called it proto-industrialization.
Yeah, it's like a step towards those big factories that we picture in our minds.
Yeah, right.
And the lecture gives some really interesting examples, like toy production in Birmingham, cutlery in Sheffield, and weaving around Reims and Nancy in France.
And I thought this was interesting. They said the average Parisian production unit in 1870 had just over 7 people working in it.
Wow.
So, that's not that big, right?
Yeah.
It really changes your picture of what industrialization looked like. It wasn't just about size. It was about, I guess, the way things were made and how they were distributed.
That's right. And all of this was happening at the same time as other huge changes, like the agricultural revolution and the growth of cities.
Yeah, like a triple whammy of revolution.
Exactly. And they're all feeding into each other.
Hmm.
You can't have all those people moving into the cities without more food being produced to support them.
Right. The lecture gave the example of Manchester growing so fast that it actually changed the countryside around it. Farmers had to specialize and produce more food to keep up with the demand.
It's amazing how these seemingly separate things are actually so connected. And while all of this is happening, I was wondering, how did this affect, let's say, women and their work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, did it give women new opportunities or did it just kind of, keep things the same?
Well, it's complicated. Women were still, really important in running the household and the family economy. But we also see them taking on new roles.
Okay.
But there are also some things that unfortunately stayed the same. Like the sources mentioned, prostitution was still a big issue, especially in the cities.
Yeah, it sounds like it was a mix of progress and, and things that really didn't change for the better.
Yeah. And as industrialization continues, we start to see what's called working class consciousness emerging.
Right, and the lecture talks about how the artisans and craftsmen, they were really the first to start thinking of themselves as a separate class, distinct from the factory owners and managers.
Yeah, they had this sense of pride in their skills, and they were often part of guilds and organizations. But they were also the ones who started feeling the negative effects of industrialization first.
Yeah, the professor mentioned the tailors in Berlin in the 1840s, how they were having trouble competing with the new factories and all the new tailors coming into the market. It was like a crisis for them.
Yeah, and it wasn't just competition. The factories also brought this whole new level of discipline to work. Like Josiah Wedgwood, the pottery guy. He wanted his workers to be like, fingers on 2 hands, totally under his control.
Wow. That's a big change from how the artisans and craftsmen used to work. Much more control from the top down.
Yeah, for sure. The professor even tells a story about working in a jam and jelly factory. Strict rules, foremen watching over everyone, a real disconnect between the workers and the bosses.
It sounds like a completely different world. So with all of these big societal and economic changes happening, how did this affect the arts and culture of the time?
Well, one thing we can't ignore is the Enlightenment. This period was all about challenging traditional ways of thinking, embracing reason and science.
Right, like thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu, they were shaking things up, criticizing religion and social norms. And what I found really interesting was that the Enlightenment wasn't just about these big ideas, it also influenced things like fashion.
Yeah, the professor mentioned how Voltaire, for example, started wearing cotton handkerchiefs, which were like the early versions of neckties, and he preferred looser, more comfortable clothing. It was like a rejection of the fancy courtly styles.
So it wasn't just an intellectual movement, it was a cultural shift.
Exactly. And at the same time, we have all these technological advancements like the printing press. This was huge because it meant that knowledge and culture could be spread much more easily.
And we see this in how stories evolve over time, right? Like the sources use the example of the 3 little pigs. That story has been told and retold for centuries, and each version reflects the anxieties and values of the time.
Yeah, from Disney's version to more modern interpretations, It's fascinating to see how the story changes. It shows how storytelling can adapt to different times and
And
cultures.
these changes are still happening today. Digital art, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, all of these things are reshaping how we create and experience culture.
It's like a whole new revolution in art is happening right now.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about that excerpt from The Value of Arts and Humanities. It makes a really strong argument for why these fields are so important, even in a world that's so focused on science and technology.
Yeah, the excerpt really highlights how arts and humanities help us develop critical thinking skills, understand different cultures, and tackle big questions. These are skills that are essential for pretty much everything we do in life.
It doesn't shy away from the social impact of arts and humanities either. It talks about how they can challenge social norms and shape our understanding of who we are.
Yeah, and it even gets into analyzing different cultural artifacts and practices from cave paintings to the stuff we see online today. That's a pretty wide-ranging look at the role of arts and humanities throughout history.
And it also talks about the history of music and performing arts. It's amazing how those forms have evolved over time and reflected all the cultural changes that have happened.
Music and performing arts have this incredible ability to connect with us on an emotional level. It goes beyond language and cultural barriers. That's something technology can't really replicate.
Right. I think that's one of the big takeaways from this deep dive. Technology is powerful, but it can't replace human connection and that shared experience of art and culture.
Exactly. The art and society piece we look at really emphasizes this. It talks about how art helps us create a sense of identity, how it can spark social change, and even contribute to economic growth.
It reminds us that art isn't just something we sit back and watch or listen to. It's something that actively shapes the world around us.
Yeah, and it talks about the importance of art in public spaces, like murals, sculptures, installations. Those things can transform a city or a neighborhood and make it more vibrant and engaging.
So art shouldn't just be in museums, it should be part of our everyday lives.
Exactly. And the piece also talks about the therapeutic benefits of art. Engaging in creative activities can help people reduce stress, improve their emotional well-being, and even process difficult emotions.
That's so important these days, especially with so many people struggling with anxiety and depression.
Yeah, and it highlights the importance of community art programs, creating spaces where people can connect and heal through creativity.
It's amazing how art can bring people together and create a sense of belonging.
And that, I think, is what this whole deep dive is really about. We've talked about the Industrial Revolution, technology, globalization, all these big forces that have shaped our world. But it's the arts and humanities that help us make sense of it all, connect with each other, and create a more just and compassionate society.
So, as technology keeps changing the world around us, how can we use it to make the arts more accessible and more meaningful for everyone?
That's a really important question, and something we should all be thinking about.
Yeah, it's a big question for sure. And speaking of big questions, how about globalization? I mean, it's had a huge impact on pretty much everything. So how has it influenced the arts?
Well, one thing that jumps out from our sources is how globalization has created this incredible mixing of cultures, which obviously affects how art is made and experienced.
Yeah, you've got this constant exchange of ideas and styles and traditions happening. It's made the global art scene so much more diverse and vibrant.
The Khan Academy video on globalization talks about how international trade has been shaping cultures for centuries. Like, think about the Silk Road or those massive shipping empires back in the 16th century. It wasn't just about trading goods. It was about sharing ideas and cultural practices too.
Right, those were like the early versions of globalization. And the video points out that technology, especially advancements in communication and transportation, has really sped things up. It's kind of crazy to think that someone sitting in their living room, let's say somewhere in rural America, can experience art and culture from all over the world because of the internet.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But, the video also brings up some of the potential downsides of all this interconnectedness, like the rise of international terrorism and civil unrest. It suggests that sometimes this increased exposure to different cultures can actually lead to more conflict.
That's a bit of a downer.
Yeah.
It seems like globalization, like a lot of things, has both good and bad sides.
Yeah, for sure. But let's focus on the positive for a minute.
Huh.
The video also talks about how globalization is creating this sense of global community where countries are becoming more and more interdependent.
And that has to have an impact on the arts, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Artists are more aware of global events and issues now,
Yeah.
and that awareness shows up in their work. We're seeing a lot more art that deals with things like social justice, environmentalism, human rights, things that affect everyone.
Almost like art is becoming this universal language, a way for people from different cultures to connect and understand each other.
Yeah, in a lot of ways it is. And technology is playing a huge role in making that happen. Social media lets artists share their work with the whole world, and online art marketplaces make it easier than ever to buy and sell art across borders.
So it's a pretty exciting time to be an artist or someone who loves art. Okay, let's move on to literature. Another area where globalization has had a big impact, I think.
Totally. I mean, literature has always been a reflection of what's going on in the world, and globalization is no different. We're seeing a rise in what's called world literature, books that go beyond national boundaries and explore themes that are relevant to everyone.
That MatCat video on literature made a really good point. It's not just about reading the words, it's about understanding the historical and cultural context that shape those words. Literature gives us a glimpse into how other people think and feel and experience the world.
And globalization has made those glimpses so much richer. We have access to literature from every corner of the planet, translated into so many different languages. It's
Fair.
like having a whole library of different perspectives at our fingertips.
It's like putting yourself in someone else's shoes and seeing the world through their eyes.
Exactly. And the video also talks about some interesting developments in literary criticism, like Marxist critics who argue that literature is a product of its time and culture. We should look at how social and economic forces influence what writers create.
And then you've got feminist critics like Simone de Beauvoir and Judith Butler who challenge traditional ideas about gender and identity. They want us to see how those ideas are shaped by society.
All these different schools of thought show just how complex literature is and how many different ways there are to interpret and analyze it. It's not just about appreciating beautiful writing, it's about engaging with ideas and questioning your own perspectives.
It's like a mental workout for your brain. Okay, let's shift gears again and talk about something that might get us moving a little bit. Dance.
Yes, dance. Like all art forms, dance has been shaped by globalization and technology. You see this fusion of different dance styles happening all the time. Contemporary choreographers are drawing inspiration from traditional dances from all over the world.
And technology is part of that fusion too, right?
Definitely. Dance videos and tutorials are everywhere online, so people can learn all kinds of styles no matter where they live. And motion capture technology is opening up all these new possibilities for choreography and performance.
It's pretty amazing how technology is making dance more accessible to people who might not have had the chance to experience it before.
It's like it's democratizing dance.
Yeah.
And we see that happening across all the arts. Online platforms are giving artists at every level a way to share their work and connect with audiences.
It's like we're living through this explosion of creativity where technology is allowing people to express themselves in ways that were unimaginable just a few decades ago.
It's a pretty incredible time to be alive, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. But even with all this talk of globalization and technology, I think it's important to remember the value of tradition.
I agree. Tradition is like our foundation. It connects us to our past. It's important to preserve and celebrate those traditions even as we embrace new forms of expression.
That Made in History video about the ancient world really brought that point home. It takes you on this journey through time, exploring the art and architecture and innovations of civilizations like ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, China. It's amazing.
Yeah, it reminds you that art and creativity have been part of human civilization from the very beginning. And even though those ancient civilizations seem so far away, their legacy lives on in the art and culture we experience today.
It's like we're standing on the shoulders of giants building on what they created.
Exactly. And as we keep evolving and changing, it's so important to remember that the past, present, and future are all connected.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, before we wrap things up, I want to go back to something that really caught my attention. The Oxford academic video on art history asks this really interesting question. Can art really have a history? Or is it something timeless and beautiful that goes beyond any historical boundaries?
That's a great question. And the video doesn't really give you a straight answer. It more encourages you to think about it from different angles.
It talks about how the way we write about art can shape how we understand its history. Like if you focus on the biographies of artists, you might interpret their work in one way, but if you analyze art through the lens of style, you might see something totally different.
Right. And then there's the whole question of whether art history is really just cultural history. Do you need to understand the bigger historical context to fully appreciate a work of art? Or can you just approach it as something beautiful to look at?
It's interesting to think about how our understanding of art is affected by the way we choose to engage with it.
Yeah, the video wants you to explore those different ways of engaging with art, to see it as a text that tells a story, to appreciate it as a physical object with its own history, and ultimately to just find joy in looking at it and responding to it.
It reminds us that art is a really rich experience with all sorts of possibilities for interpretation and enjoyment. Now, before we get to our final thoughts, there's one more thing I wanted to highlight from the sources.
Okay, I'm all ears. What is it?
It's how much the sources emphasize the importance of arts and humanities, not just for ourselves, but for society as a whole. It's like they're pushing back against this idea that art and humanities are somehow less important than science and technology in today's world.
Yeah, I noticed that too. The Foundations of Arts and Humanities excerpt really makes that point. It says that studying these fields gives us the tools to understand different cultures, think critically, and grapple with those big questions about life. And those aren't just, nice to have skills. They're essential for navigating the world we live in.
And that excerpt goes even further. It talks about how arts and humanities help shape our values and challenge the way things are. It even gets into analyzing cultural stuff from cave paintings to, social media. It's really pretty impressive.
Yeah, and it doesn't shy away from contemporary issues either, like how globalization and all the digital technology are changing the role of arts and humanities. It's really up to date.
It covers the history of music and performing arts, too. It's fascinating to see how these art forms have changed over time, reflecting what's happening in society and sometimes even driving social movements.
It's true. Music and performing arts have this amazing ability to connect with us on such a deep level. They can transcend language and cultural differences. That's something that technology just can't replicate.
And that brings me to another big takeaway from all of this. I think technology is incredibly powerful, but it can never replace real human connection and the shared experience of art and culture.
I totally agree. The art and society piece really digs into this. It talks about how art helps us define who we are as individuals and as communities. It can spark social change and even contribute to a country's economy.
It's a good reminder that art isn't just something we passively consume. It has the power to actually change the world around us.
Yeah, and it also talks about how important it is to have art in public spaces.
Mm.
Things like murals and sculptures and installations. They can turn ordinary places into something really special and engaging.
So art shouldn't be trapped in museums. It should be out in the world where everyone can experience it.
For sure. And the piece also talks about how art can be therapeutic. Doing something creative can reduce stress, help you deal with your emotions, and just make you feel better overall.
That's so important right now with so many people feeling stressed and anxious and isolated.
Definitely. And it also highlights the importance of community art programs. They provide a safe and welcoming space for people to connect and heal through art.
It's really beautiful to think about how art can foster empathy and understanding and create a sense of belonging.
I think that's the core message of this whole deep dive. We talked about the Industrial Revolution, technology, globalization, all these forces that have shaped the world we live in. But ultimately, it's the arts and humanities that help us understand what it all means. They help us connect with each other and build a more just and compassionate world.
So as technology continues to reshape our world, how can we use it to make sure the arts are accessible and meaningful for everyone?
That's the question we all need to be thinking about and working on together.
Well, it looks like we've reached the end of our deep dive, but this is just the beginning. Keep those minds curious, keep exploring, keep searching for different perspectives, and keep diving deep into this amazing world we live in. Until next time.